The wind over Dry Creek carried a strange silence that evening, too still for comfort, too heavy for peace. The sun bled red into the horizon, painting the dying light across the barren plains like a wound that refused to close. From the Weaver farm, a single horse cart rolled down the dirt road, wooden wheels creaking under the weight of something more than just bodies, of decisions, secrets, and fate itself. At 19, Mary Ellen Carter had never been kissed, never been told she was beautiful, never been allowed to dream. But that night, she was told she was getting married, to a man twice her age, a man she barely knew. Her father had made the deal over whiskey and debt. The poor farmer, Tom Weaver, had offered what little he had, a small patch of land, a mule, and the promise to feed her. In Dry Creek, that was as good as love could buy. When her father came home that afternoon, reeking of sweat and liquor, he didn't ask. He simply said, "Pack your things, Mary. You're getting married by sundown." She stared at him in disbelief. "Married? To who?" "Tom Weaver," he said, scratching his neck. "He's a decent man, don't argue." Her voice trembled. "But I don't even know him." "Ha! You'll get to, and you'll thank me for it. Better than starving under this roof." The old man walked out before she could say another word. By the time the sun began to die, she stood on the porch of the tiny town chapel, wearing a plain white dress her mother once sewed years ago. It didn't fit quite right. It smelled of cedar and loneliness. Her hands shook so badly that she almost dropped the wilted bouquet of daisies the preacher's wife had forced into her palms. Tom stood waiting near the altar. He looked nothing like she had imagined. His face was rough, carved by wind and years of hard labor, but his eyes, those deep gray eyes, carried something unreadable, a quiet sorrow that didn't belong to a man of his age. The preacher spoke quickly, the words hollow and rehearsed. No music, no guests, only the wooden walls of the chapel and the echo of their vows. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Tom hesitated. His jaw clenched. Then he simply nodded and whispered, "Let's go home." No kiss, no smile, no hand reaching for hers. Mary's heart sank, and for a moment, she thought she might faint right there on the altar. But she didn't. She swallowed her tears, straightened her shoulders, and followed the man who was now her husband out into the cooling dusk. The wagon ride back to the farm was silent. The horse's hooves struck the ground with a rhythm that sounded too much like a heartbeat. Mary glanced sideways at Tom. His face was still, unreadable, but his hands gripped the reins so tightly that the knuckles were white. "Mr. Weaver," she began softly. He didn't look at her. "You can call me Tom." She hesitated. "Tom, then, why did you marry me?" His voice came low, almost too quiet to hear. "Because your father offered, and I said yes." Her stomach twisted. She'd turned away, watching the plains stretch endlessly before them. The world had never felt so wide, and she had never felt so small. When they reached the farm, it was darker than she'd expected. Just a small wooden cabin near the edge of a wheat field, surrounded by the low hum of crickets. A single lamp burned in the window, casting a lonely glow. He helped her down from the wagon, still silent. "You'll take the bed inside," he said, voice rough. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight." Mary blinked. "But, it's our wedding night." "I know," he said quietly, turning away. "I ain't that kind of man." She didn't understand. Not yet. Inside, the cabin was simple. Wooden table, 2 chairs, a stove, a narrow bed against the wall. Everything smelled faintly of smoke. And leather. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to his footsteps fade toward the barn. Then came the sound of the door closing, the wind pressing softly against the windows, and the distant sigh of the horses. She stared at her hands. 19 years old, married, and alone. Outside, Tom stood in the barn, leaning against a post. The horses shifted restlessly. From a shadowed corner came a faint cough, then a weak voice. "Tom." He turned. There, under a thin blanket on a pile of straw, lay a young woman, pale, fragile, her skin gray with sickness. "I'm here," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Is she the one?" The girl whispered, her breath trembling. He nodded. "Mary, she's inside. She don't know yet." The girl smiled faintly, though her lips were cracked. "She'll hate you when she finds out." "Maybe," he said, but I had no choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bottle, the last of the medicine he'd managed to buy. He tipped a few drops between her lips, brushing her hair back gently. "You rest, Clara. I'll check on you in the morning." She closed her eyes. "Don't let her see me." "Not yet." Tom sat beside her long after she fell asleep. He watched the shadows move across the barn walls and wondered what kind of man he had become. A man who married out of desperation, not love. But he couldn't let Clara die. Not after everything they'd been through. The next morning, Mary woke to the smell of coffee. She found Tom sitting on the porch, hat tipped low, watching the horizon. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. "Good morning," she said timidly. He nodded without turning. "Mornin'." She stepped closer. "I can make breakfast, if you'd like." He finally looked up. There was something soft in his eyes now, something she hadn't noticed before. "If you want," he said. As she cooked, she caught him watching her once or twice, quietly, as though trying to read something on her face. When she smiled, he looked away quickly, pretending to be busy with his coffee. Days passed like that, silent, careful, almost tender. He worked the fields from dawn to dusk, and she learned the rhythm of the house. The squeak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind through the window cracks, the sound of his boots on the porch when he came in for supper. At night, he always went back to the barn. She'd lie awake listening, wondering what he did out there, wondering why she felt both safe and painfully lonely. One evening, curiosity got the better of her. The moon was full, and the air smelled of dust and hay. She slipped on her shawl and crept outside, barefoot, careful not to make a sound. The barn door was slightly open. She peered through the gap, then froze. There, under the lantern's dim light, was Tom. He knelt beside a sick woman, feeding her water from a tin cup. Mary's breath caught. The woman looked young, too young to be his wife, too fragile to be a stranger. She'd pushed the door open. "Tom." He turned sharply, eyes wide. "Mary, wait." But she was already staring at the woman, confusion turning to disbelief. "Who is she?" Tom stood, stepping toward her, his face pale. "She's my sister." Mary's voice shook. "Your sister? She's sick. Has been for months. Doctor said she wouldn't make it through the winter. I couldn't afford her medicine anymore, he swallowed hard. "So I married you, to save her." The word struck her like a slap. "You used me," she whispered. "No," he said quickly, voice breaking. "I needed help, not money. Someone to cook, to keep the house, to make this place a home again. I didn't mean to hurt you." Tears filled her eyes. "You lied to me. On our wedding night." He shook his head. "I couldn't touch you, Mary. Not while she was dying under my roof. It wouldn't have been right." For a long moment, neither spoke. The barn was filled with the soft breathing of the sick woman, the faint rustle of hay, and the weight of truth. Then Mary stepped closer to the bed. The girl's skin was cold, her breathing shallow. Without a word, Mary knelt beside her and took her hand. Tom watched, silent, as Mary wiped the girl's forehead with her sleeve. "She needs more water," Mary said finally. He nodded, unable to speak. That night, she didn't return to the cabin. She stayed in the barn, nursing Clara through her fever, whispering prayers into the dark. When Tom tried to relieve her, she shook her head. "Go rest. I'll stay." He didn't argue. For the first time in months, he let himself close his eyes and sleep. Days turned into weeks. The farm began to breathe again. Mary learned to care for Clara as if she were her own sister, feeding her broth, washing her sheets, singing softly when the pain came. Tom watched them both with quiet awe. Sometimes he caught Mary in the morning light, her hair undone, her hands busy with the wash, and something inside him would ache. Not with guilt, but with something deeper, older, like the beginning of love. One cold night in December, Clara's breathing grew faint. Tom sat by her bed, holding her hand, while Mary stood behind him, silent tears falling. "Tom," Clara whispered, "you can stop worrying now." He shook his head. "Don't talk like that." She smiled weakly. "You have someone to look after you now." And then, she was gone. The barn fell silent, the world holding its breath. Tom lowered his head, shoulders shaking. Mary knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his trembling frame. "She's free now," she whispered. "You did everything you could." He didn't answer. He only wept, years of pain, loss, and loneliness spilling out into her arms. The next morning, they buried Clara beneath the oak tree behind the barn. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of earth and the faint song of larks. Mary laid a single white daisy on the grave. That night, When the fire burned low in the hearth, Tom finally came inside. He hesitated at the door, hat in hand. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I wouldn't blame you if you left." Mary looked at him, eyes red but steady. "And go where, Tom? I belong here now." He took a step closer. "After what I did, what you did," she said softly, "was try to save someone you loved. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human." For a long moment, they stood there, the firelight flickering between them. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. He hesitated, then let her fingers intertwine with his. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of grief, forgiveness, and something fragile but real. When he kissed her, it wasn't out of desire or duty, it was gratitude. It was a promise. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the fields whispering, the soft murmur of life continuing. In Dry Creek, folks would talk for years about the poor farmer who married the Carter girl. They'd say it was a marriage of convenience, born from desperation. But what they didn't know, what no one ever saw, was how, in the small wooden cabin at the edge of the prairie, love had quietly taken root in two broken hearts. He had married her to save a life, and in the end, she saved his.